by her.
Of course. Why are you my friend? Oh, actually, we're not friends, right?
Later, let's see how. Okay, but the main reason I'm here is because I want to talk about this topic called atomic CSS. And if you haven't heard of it, I'll touch on it later on. But let me just get into it first. So I'm Sheldon. I work at SP Singapore Power, as previously mentioned. And I work in the digital team. So this is who we are. So I didn't come up with this title by myself, how to use atomic CSS and sleep at night. So I came across this article some time back. And this is JavaScript, so I won't go too in-depth on it. But when ES6 classes were introduced into the language, it created a lot of controversy and divided opinion. So I think in the CSS world, one recent trend that I think is causing the similar division is atomic CSS. And if you've seen atomic CSS before, I think most people would probably be disgusted by it. So let me just show you how it looks like. Anybody seen this before? Okay. Disgusted by it?
Why is it always us? This is probably why we're running this.
Me too.
Exactly.
Great. So actually this kind of syntax comes with a few names. So atomic, functional, I think the first two terms are quite interchangeable. So last month at Talk CSS, Ed Moore from 90 Seconds had a talk on this as well. So he called it functional CSS. I call it atomic CSS. I think it's the more common term. And there's another kind of atomic CSS that looks like this. So when I first saw this, right, I thought hey, this must be what the functional CSS is about, right? Because it looks like passing in arguments into functions. But guess what? It's not. It's called ACSS. Anybody wants to guess what that is? Wait, let me give you a clue. Anybody want to guess now? It's actually called atomic CSS. And if you go to acss.io, it describes this technique where you actually write the classes like this in HTML, and something called the atomizer passes through HTML and generates the style sheets for you based on this cryptic syntax here. So if you take that approach, you don't even need to touch style sheets anymore. So I can't stomach this at the moment, so I haven't tried it yet. But yeah, I think it's a bit of taken too far. Another article calls it programmatic atomic CSS, and I think that's a fair name. But for the rest of this talk, when I say atomic CSS, I'm not referring to this. So, how do you get here? Conventional CSS, I think if you're a front-end developer, you've probably heard of all the good best practices like object-oriented CSS, BAM methodology, SMAX. And they kind of advocate this approach where you create a panel. If you're creating a panel, just give it a name like panel and you put in the classes like this, right? So it's like component-first naming methodology. What atomic CSS advocates is doing it this way. Yeah, I heard somebody laugh already. So yeah, splitting up all the styles into individual classes, right? What happened to all the good practices of just creating a button class and then it's a different just button dash primary, right? So that's what atomic CSS is about. So just taking it back to the beginning, how do we, yeah, so a lot of big names in the web industry has weighed in on this topic, and yeah, there's the most common criticism is how is it different from inline styles? It's back to the dark days of web development and all that. So how do we end up here? I think one way to look at it is that you can create your styles using on a scale from semantic to not semantic, right? So I think very long ago, a lot of us tried doing this. Content-based class naming. So if your designer gives you this thing called looks like a profile, so I call it a profile. And using some bad methodology, I call it profile, image, name, body, and all that. So far, it makes sense, right? Then the next day, your designer gives you this thing that looks like a profile component, but it's not. It's like a post or article. And now, you can't really use that same class again on this component because it's not semantic anymore. What you have is a post, you can't use profile on it, right? It's going to break your semantic approach. So one way to deal with it is you could say, oh, I'm just going to create a post component, a post class with the exact same styles. Then it's not very dry anymore. And it's very easy for these two components, which look similar, to have like minor differences. If you accidentally change the font size or something, then these two components, which are supposed to be similar, will look different. And that's probably not what your designer wanted. So that means this way of doing things is not reusable. So then go back and think about it, and hey, you probably need something that's content agnostic.
At that point, why wouldn't you just rename the component to something that means something?
Sorry, rename.
So if it's not profile, it's not a post, why not call it something
Generic.
Yeah, so that's what I'm going to go on to actually.
Sorry.
That's the man.
Yeah, so you go back and think about it. I need something generic that applies to both classes, right? So there's another point in the middle that's like content agnostic. So you don't tie your class names to your content types anymore. So no profile, no post or whatever. You go with something like media card. So this is based on the object-oriented CSS approach that Nicole Sullivan introduced to us. And so it's just changing one class name profile to media card, and then the name changed to title, and that's it, right? So pretty straightforward. And then now you have a usable class that applies for all scenarios. But what if one day your designer comes to you and then he gives you a new post design or profile design, and it's now different? Now they're different. So in the end, you still got to go back and refactor stuff. So this idea of separation of concerns, where you put styling in CSS and instruction in HTML, it's never that clean. You can't really get away with complete separation. So why not take it to the next level and look at atomic CSS? So I didn't really test out these classes, but I think it's just confusing enough that I think you get what I mean. So it's using up all these tiny classes to create this, and one way to look at this scale, right? On the left, semantic, you have CSS that depends on HTML. That means your HTML defines what class names you use based on content, so profile, post, article, and what have you. And the other end of the spectrum is where HTML depends on CSS. So how that goes is you create your CSS classes, and the developer looks at these classes, uses these classes to build up the mockups that the designer hands over to them. Personally, I advocate a approach somewhere between OCSS and Atomic, where you still keep using your old school conventional class names, but mix in with utility classes for like spacing, alignment, and all that kind of thing. So how I'm doing this at where I am now, I think most of you probably have done styles like this before. So if you actually think about it, this is actually an evolution of OCSS, utility classes, they call it. Then eventually my developers take just a quick story again. When I joined SP, my first task was to create a UI library. And this is going to be used across multiple Rails projects. So these Rails developers / full stack / backend developers, they don't really care about CSS. They don't really care what conventions you use, what naming, styles you use, how you build your architecture. What they want is predictable changes. They want classes they can add and remove with predictable results. So that got me thinking, like, maybe the atomic CSS approach is not too bad after all. So I first started with classes like this, so it's just margins, and eventually it became, it compiles to this on the right. Then they wanted more. They wanted like styles that work on multiple breakpoints. They want padding, they want margin, they want the whole lot. And that led me to creating this fancy thing. So this mixin is a breakpoint all mixin. Let me just show you how it looks like. So over here, I'm passing in like sizes, right, based on this. So I'm basically creating a style for every unit of margin and padding for every breakpoint you could think of. And total, I ended up with 3,480 lines, including the spacing in between. And if you think that's bad, look at, so I generate the bundle CSS, right, and I search for media, and I get 498 instances of it. Yes, that's a downfall to this, or rather a catch to this approach lah. But guess what? There's this thing called MQ Packer on NPM. What it does, it aggregates all these different breakpoints and it combines all the classes into the different breakpoints. So there are some caveats to that, but basically this is what ended up my bundle size, reduced by quite a bit. And now I have only 4 media breakpoints. Of course, this is minified and all that, but as you can see, it's like all crushed together now. And yeah, so this is what my developers look at. It's like a kind of like a style guide thing, which they use to style their websites. So I guess what I want to take away from here is that atomic CSS is not all that bad. There are some good parts to it. It's not an all or nothing approach. So I didn't look at tachyons and say, hey, this looks like a good idea and I should try using it. The way I've done it came about from the working environment I'm in, and it just evolved over time as a necessity. And you should probably use it with a conventional approach. So I'd say just build your components the same way you do now, like a BAM or what have you. And then you do the spacings with object-oriented CSS. So margins, paddings, basically laying out the components on the page. So you use that along with your grid styling that you probably are using already. And if you want to try, you can take something like tachyons and then start using that from the start before abstracting out patterns that come across that appear after you have done your a few pages. Then extract all those multiple classes into a proper component after that. And in the end, it might not work for you, and that's fine. So I think atomic CSS works better in a larger scale project with multiple developers. So I used to work in an agency before, and I think the kind of projects that are handled there are small enough and short time frame enough that you don't really have to maintain stuff afterwards, and you can get away with pretty much any approach in that case, whether it's BAMs, Max, Suit CSS, and all that. So I think I'd like to leave you with a quote. You can't predict the future. That's why you should always favor composition over inheritance. So I just want to reiterate that I'm not advocating the all-in tachyon CSS style, but rather take the best parts of atomic CSS, like the way I'm using now is like spacing utilities, and try it in your projects, and maybe you'll find that it's pretty useful after all. So thanks for your time. Any questions?
Questions? I'm not
Yes.
coming at you
Okay.
because I'm nice. That's good. You said good things about Atomic CSS. And we promise to be civil. Any questions? Anyone? So are you still the primary maintainer of CSS at SP?
Yes.
Okay.
Pretty much the only maintainer for the past 8 months.
Fair enough.
Do we have announcements? Does
Yeah, I actually have an
anybody?
announcement.
Yeah.
As always.
Oh, okay.
The obligatory we are hiring page.
SP should change
Yeah.
their name to perpetually hiring PH. Anyway. Sorry.
Yeah,
He's
so-
late. I tired.
I'm
Tired
the
too,
one really
man.
confused. Yes, I agree. Zell, are you hiring anyone?
Yeah. If you are interested, me or Michael here, my colleague.
Or you could throw a
And,
stone and just hit a random SP engineer walking around Singapore all day. Anyway, so sorry.
It's not that bad. Okay. Yeah, I'll post all these references on.
Should we do announcements before we know all that stuff?
What do we have?
Announcements.
Okay, you say.
Okay, can.